This is intolerable language. How can anyone accept it? We have these words of some of the followers of Jesus at the time in our gospel today. Just a few weeks ago, there was a campaign at the time when we had the census, where there were a few people who said that the language of the Catholic Church, the language of Christianity is intolerable, and that people should no longer believe. They should write down on the census that they are no longer Catholics, that they're people of no religion. You might have heard something of this campaign. Over the last few weeks, we have been reading through John chapter 6. We had a couple of weeks off with the celebration for the Assumption, and then, and also before that, the celebration of St. Mary of the Cross McKillop. But we started about 5 weeks ago reading John chapter 6, which is the great teaching of Jesus on the Eucharist. The Eucharist is a hard teaching, and it was hard for the people at the time of Jesus. Literally, we're hearing them say, "This is intolerable language. How can anybody accept it that we must eat of your flesh, drink of your blood?" This was so graphic for them. And it wasn't just eating, it was sort of almost like gnawing. They were sort of like to chew. This was really hard language. And we have this statement of Peter at the end of this gospel. "Lord, who shall we go to? You have the message of eternal life, and we believe. We know that you are the Holy One of God." This is what defines us. As Christians, as Catholics, we believe. We believe in the Eucharist. This is why we gather on a Sunday. This is why we gather on a Sunday even virtually, because we believe that something incredible, a miracle is happening every time we gather around this altar. It's hard to accept, but there is a miracle happening here. This is why we gather, because we believe and we want to be close to Jesus Christ. John chapter 6, verse 66 is one of the most unfortunate verses in the whole scriptures. John, who writes the book of Revelation, uses this number again and refers to this number as the number for evil. 666. This is the only place you'll see in the scriptures, chapter 6, verse 66. And the verse is this: "After this, many of his disciples left him and stopped going with him." After this, many of his disciples left him and stopped going with him. This is hard. The presence of evil wants us to have doubts about our faith. Evil wants us to say, we find the language of Jesus Christ and the church intolerable, and we cannot believe. Over the last few weeks, over the last few months, we've had to reconsider where we find Jesus Christ. And some people might be looking in different places. They might say, "Well, I don't believe. I find it too difficult. I just can't get to church. I just don't like any of the live streaming," or whatever the situation. And there might be all sorts of reasons to say, "I'm going to go searching for Jesus Christ elsewhere." John 6:66. Many of his disciples left him and stopped going with him. The response of Peter is to believe and is to continue to walk with Jesus. And that's our response as well. Even when it's difficult, even when the world says this is intolerable, even when people are walking and going in different directions, we believe and we stay with Jesus. So Paul, writing to the Ephesians in the second reading, in some places people refer to this reading as intolerable language as well. That this is just completely archaic and has no place in a modern society. But the real way of understanding this second reading is not about wives and husbands, but it's about obedience to Christ. And we're told at the very end of this reading that this mystery has many implications, but I'm saying that it applies to Christ and the church. That the unity that happens between a husband and wife is what happens in the Eucharist. We are completely at one with the church and with Christ when we receive Holy Communion. There is no separation. And this is what St. Paul is teaching us both in relation to marriage, but also in relation to the Eucharist. That between a husband and wife, there is complete unity. Not subservience, not dictatorship, but service to each other through obedience to Christ. And that brings about a unity, a covenant that cannot be broken. This is the beauty of marriage. It's an incredible thing. But this is also the beauty of the Eucharist, that we become completely united with Christ. Often when we come to communion, we may not feel or see the effects of this immense unity that happens. The heaven and earth are united for just a few moments. A number of years ago, I was working at the border between Lebanon and Israel, in a place, a military zone where there had been a lot of hurt, similar to what we might be seeing in parts of Afghanistan, even in this last week. There are many people who were experiencing, in that place when I was there, trauma. Many had injuries, physical injuries and intellectual injuries, psychological injuries as to what had happened. And I was helping with a church program which cares for people with disabilities, intellectual disabilities, but also physical disabilities. And I was asked to go and be the chaplain for this program for about a month because the regular priest needed a holiday. He hadn't had a holiday for a while. And so I came from Rome, where I was, to work there for a month. And it was quite incredible being in this place. There was all sorts of trauma. There were people who had different forms of autism. And if you've been in places where people have quite severe autism, it can be very difficult for people to not make noise. And there'd be yells and screams and screeches a lot of the time. You might have seen this in some places. And when I would celebrate Mass with about the 50 or 60 people we had there, with disabilities and the carers and the other people who helped in this place, there was all sorts of noises. When I would preach and when we'd hear the readings, there were noises. We had the offertory, there was noises. But I noticed something a number of times, that when we got to the words of the consecration, that just for a few moments, a few minutes, there was silence. That heaven and earth had united and each was at peace. And it was an amazing experience. When we come to the Eucharist, there is a miracle happening every single time. We can say no, we find it too hard to believe, we're going to doubt, and we're going to say, no, we'll just go somewhere else. Or the language is just intolerable, as we hear at the beginning of our gospel. Or we can say, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the message of eternal life. We believe, and we know that you are the Holy One of God. We can't receive Holy Communion today, most of us. There's 3 people in the church here with me in our congregation, and you can see 2 here on the sanctuary. Ask Jesus to come spiritually into you. Make a commitment today that as soon as the restrictions are lifted, one of the highest priorities, one of the first things you can do once the restrictions are lifted is to come back to church, to participate and to receive Holy Communion reverently and respectfully, to welcome Jesus in the Eucharist inside you. We believe, we know that you are the Holy One of God.